He reached the summit. He sent a message to his family saying he had made it. And then Austin King, a 22-year-old park employee who knew Yellowstone better than most visitors ever will, simply vanished from the highest point in the park. The search that followed would involve over 100 people, helicopters, drones, and tracking dogs. They found his campsite. They found a note that investigators have described as deeply unsettling. But they never found Austin King. This is one of 4 cases we will examine today. 4 people who disappeared in American national parks under circumstances that challenge everything we think we know about wilderness survival and search operations. But these are not stories of inexperienced tourists who wandered off marked trails. These are people who knew exactly where they were. Park employees, veteran trail runners, experienced solo hikers who had spent years in these mountains. People who understood the dangers and prepared for them. People who should not have vanished. A young man who worked in Yellowstone and chose to climb its most remote peak alone, reaching the top only to disappear on his way down. A 16-year-old boy who went searching for his lost sister in Yellowstone nearly 60 years ago and was never seen again, despite one of the largest search operations in the park history. A woman who worked seasonally in Yosemite and vanished on what should have been a simple day hike, her backpack appearing 8 years later in a drainage far from any trail with no trace of her remains. And a 49-year-old elite trail runner who knew every technical route around Long's Peak and dissolved into the Colorado wilderness on a path he had run dozens of times before. What connects these cases is not inexperience or poor judgment. What connects them is the opposite. These were people who belonged in the wilderness. People who had earned the right to be there through training, through work, through years of building knowledge about these specific places. And yet the mountains took them anyway. The pattern is unmistakable. Experienced individuals vanishing in terrain they knew intimately. Massive search operations finding almost nothing. And questions that remain unanswered years and even decades later. If you find these accounts as disturbing as we do, consider subscribing to our channel. We document cases that official sources prefer not to discuss and patterns that no one has been able to explain. Hit the notification bell so you do not miss our future investigations. Our first case takes us to the most remote corner of Yellowstone National Park, to a peak so isolated that fewer people climb it each year than summit Everest, and to a young man who made it to the top and sent proof that he was alive, only to vanish somewhere between the summit and the world below. Yellowstone National Park sprawls across nearly 2.2 million acres of volcanic terrain in the northwest corner of Wyoming, spilling over into Montana and Idaho. It is the first national park ever established, created in 1872, and remains one of the most geologically active places on Earth. Beneath its forests and meadows lies a supervolcano capable of continental devastation. Hot springs boil, geysers erupt. The ground itself breathes with thermal energy that reminds visitors they are walking on a thin crust above something immensely powerful. Most visitors to Yellowstone stay near the roads, watching Old Faithful, photographing bison, and marveling at the prismatic colors of the thermal pools. They do not venture into the backcountry. They do not climb to the places where the park reveals its true wilderness. One of those places is Eagle Peak, the highest point in Yellowstone at 11,358 feet above sea level. Located in the park's southeast corner, Eagle Peak sits in the Absaroka Range, a landscape of jagged ridges, steep talus slopes, and unpredictable weather. The approach requires multiple days of hiking through terrain that sees almost no human traffic. There are no maintained trails to the summit. The final ascent involves scrambling over loose rock at high altitude, where storms can materialize in minutes. Austin King knew all of this. He had spent the summer of 2024 working as a seasonal employee in Yellowstone Concession Department. He was 22 years old, originally from the Midwest, and had fallen in love with the park landscape during his time there. Co-workers described him as thoughtful, physically fit, and deeply drawn to the backcountry. He had hiked extensively throughout the park during his off days, building his skills and his knowledge of the terrain. By September, he felt ready to attempt something few Yellowstone employees ever try. He wanted to reach Eagle Peak. Austin planned his route carefully. He would hike into the backcountry on September 14, 2024, following a multi-day route that would take him through the Thoroughfare region, one of the most isolated areas in the lower 48 states. The Thoroughfare is so remote that it is sometimes called the most distant place from a road in the contiguous United States. From there, he would climb to the summit of Eagle Peak. His plan was to finish the journey at the southeast arm of Yellowstone Lake, where he had arranged to be picked up by boat on September 20th. Before departing, Austin registered his itinerary with the park and informed his family of his plans. He carried appropriate gear for backcountry travel, including food, water filtration, emergency supplies, and a device capable of sending satellite messages. He was not reckless. He was not unprepared. By all accounts, he was doing everything right. The first several days of the trek proceeded according to plan. Austin made steady progress through the thoroughfare, navigating the maze of drainages and ridges that define this corner of Yellowstone. He stayed in contact with family members, sending periodic updates via satellite. His messages were upbeat. He was enjoying the solitude, the challenge, and the raw beauty of a part of Yellowstone that most people will never see. On September 17th, Austin began his summit attempt on Eagle Peak. The weather that day was deteriorating. A system was moving in from the west, bringing fog, rain, wind, and even hail to the high country. Austin noted the conditions in his communications, but expressed his intention to continue. He had come too far to turn back with the summit within reach. Sometime that day, Austin King stood on the highest point in Yellowstone National Park. He had done it. He sent a message to his loved ones confirming his success. He was alive. He was on top. That was the last confirmed communication anyone received from him. When Austin did not arrive at the southeast arm of Yellowstone Lake on September 20th as planned, concern grew quickly. His family contacted the Yellowstone Interagency Communications Center to report him overdue. By September 21st, search and rescue operations were underway. The initial search focused on the area between Eagle Peak and the southeast arm, the route Austin would have taken on his descent. Teams on foot began working their way into the backcountry, but the terrain immediately presented challenges. This is not a place where searchers can move quickly. The slopes are steep, the footing is treacherous, and the distances are vast. Helicopter support was deployed to scan the ridges and valleys from above. On the second day of the search, teams located a campsite in the upper Howell Creek drainage, not far from his planned route. The discovery should have been encouraging. It meant they were on the right track. But what they found at the campsite raised more questions than it answered. His gear was there. His tent, his supplies, items that a hiker descending from a summit would typically carry. The campsite appeared to have been set up properly, not abandoned in haste or disturbed by animals. But Austin himself was not there. And there were no clear tracks or signs indicating which direction he had gone after leaving this spot. Even more disturbing was what searchers found at the summit of Eagle Peak itself. A team that reached the peak discovered a note that Austin had written on September 17th, the day he summited. The note was addressed to his family. In it, Austin described his experience on the mountain. He wrote about the brutal weather, the fog that limited visibility, the cold that numbed his fingers, the hail that pelted him as he pushed toward the top. He described taking a wrong turn on his approach and having to navigate technical terrain without ropes or climbing gear. He wrote about the difficulty and the triumph of reaching the summit, despite everything. The contents of this note have not been fully released to the public, but sources close to the investigation have described it as unsettling. Media reports have used words like haunting and eerie. Some who have read it suggest that his state of mind at the summit may have been affected by the extreme conditions. Others have noted passages that seem to reflect a person grappling with something beyond simple exhaustion. One excerpt that has been shared publicly reads, in part, "I cannot feel my fingers and my goggles are fogged up from the relentless mountain weather. I cannot actually believe I am here. Had to endure a lot to get here. Rain, wet snow, Hail, the worst wind and fog in my memory. Austin concluded the note by writing that he would never forget this day for the rest of his life. The search operation expanded over the following days. At its peak, more than 90 people were involved, including National Park Service personnel, search and rescue volunteers from surrounding counties, and specialists with experience in high-altitude wilderness recovery. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the Absaroka Range. Drones equipped with cameras surveyed slopes too steep or unstable for human searchers to access safely. Teams with tracking dogs worked the drainages and ridgelines, trying to pick up any trace of his scent. The dogs found nothing beyond the campsite. No trail leading away. No indication of which direction he had gone. The scent simply ended at that one location. The weather, which had been deteriorating even before Austin summited, continued to worsen. By late September, snow was falling in the high country. Accumulations reached several feet in some areas, burying any potential tracks or evidence. Temperatures plummeted. The window for finding Austin alive was closing rapidly. Searchers covered an enormous area: Eagle Peak, Eagle Pass, the Mountain Creek Trail, the drainages that flow toward Yellowstone Lake. They checked every logical route that a descending hiker might take. They searched places that were not logical, just in case Austin had become disoriented and wandered off course. They found nothing. No footprints in the mud or snow. No torn clothing caught on branches. No sign that Austin had passed through any of the terrain between his campsite and civilized ground. It was as if he had reached the summit of Eagle Peak, written his note, and then ceased to exist. On October 2nd, 2024, after nearly 2 weeks of intensive searching, the National Park Service made the difficult decision to transition from a search and rescue operation to a recovery effort. This terminology shift is significant. It means that authorities no longer believed there was a realistic chance of finding Austin alive. The focus shifted from rescue to the eventual recovery of remains, whenever and if ever that might occur. His father, who had been following the search with desperate hope, announced that he would not give up. He stated publicly that he planned to return to the area in the spring of 2025, when snowmelt might reveal what the winter had hidden. He expressed gratitude to the searchers, but made clear that for the family, the search was not over. As of now, Austin King has not been found. The case has generated significant attention, particularly because of the note left at the summit. What was Austin trying to communicate? Was the message simply a journal entry, a record of an accomplishment achieved under brutal conditions? Or was there something else in those words, something that might explain why he never came down? Several theories have been proposed to explain what happened on Eagle Peak. The accident theory is the most straightforward. According to this view, Austin successfully summited but encountered trouble on his descent. The weather was severe. Visibility was poor. The terrain is technical and unforgiving. A single misstep on wet rock, a slip on a patch of ice, a moment of disorientation in the fog. Any of these could have sent him tumbling into a ravine or over a cliff. His body could be lying in a location so remote and inaccessible that searchers simply could not reach it. The heavy snowfall that followed would have buried any remains, making discovery impossible until spring or even later. This theory is plausible. The Absaroka Range has claimed lives before. The terrain around Eagle Peak is among the most dangerous in Yellowstone. But there are aspects of the case that this theory does not fully address. First, there is the campsite. Austin gear was found at a camp in the Howell Creek drainage. If he set up camp after summiting, that suggests he made it down from the peak alive. He did not die on the descent itself. He reached a lower elevation, established his shelter, and then something happened. But what? Second, there is the complete absence of any trail. Searchers with dogs could not find a scent leading away from the campsite. 90 people combing the wilderness could not locate a single footprint, a single piece of fabric, a single trace of Austin beyond that one location. People do not simply evaporate. Bodies do not disappear entirely. Even in the most remote wilderness, even under heavy snow, some evidence typically remains. Third, there is the note. Investigators have not released its full contents, and that decision itself is unusual. What is in those pages that authorities do not want the public to see? Is it simply private grief, a personal message to family? Or is there something that might change how we understand what happened? An alternative theory suggests that Austin may have experienced a psychological crisis at or near the summit. High altitude can affect cognition. Exhaustion, hypothermia, and isolation can alter perception and decision-making. The note at the summit has been described as reflecting a troubled state of mind. Some have speculated that Austin may have made a deliberate choice not to return. This theory is painful to consider, but it must be acknowledged. The wilderness attracts people who are searching for something, and not all of those searches end in the way we might hope. However, those who knew Austin have pushed back strongly against this interpretation. They describe him as happy, engaged, and looking forward to future plans. There is no clear evidence to support this theory beyond speculation about the tone of the note. A third theory ventures into territory that official investigators typically avoid. Austin King was a park employee. He knew Yellowstone. He had spent months learning its trails, its dangers, its rhythms. He prepared carefully for this trip. He did everything right. And yet, the mountain took him anyway. Researchers who study unusual disappearances in wilderness areas have noted that park employees and experienced outdoorsmen are not immune to these events. If anything, their familiarity with the terrain seems to provide no protection. They vanish just as completely as novice hikers. Their knowledge does not save them. Their preparation does not matter. Something happens to them that cannot be explained by simple accident or human error. The pattern is disturbing because it suggests that expertise is not a defense. Whatever is taking people in these wild places does not discriminate between the experienced and the inexperienced. It takes who it takes. What really happened to Austin King on Eagle Peak? Did he slip and fall into an unmarked crevice where his body will never be found? Did the mountain weather overwhelm him despite his preparation? Did something break inside him at that summit, alone in the fog and cold, having achieved what he set out to achieve? Or did something else happen? Something that cannot be explained by accident or intent. Something that connects his disappearance to the dozens of other cases where experienced people have vanished without a trace in American wilderness. We do not know. The investigation remains open. The family has not given up hope. But as of today, the highest point in Yellowstone holds on to its secret. Austin King reached the summit and sent word that he was alive. Then the mountain swallowed him. His case is a reminder that the wilderness does not care about our preparations. It does not respect our knowledge or our experience. It takes who it wants to take, and sometimes it gives nothing back. If this case disturbs you, consider what it means for the rest of us. If a park employee who knew these mountains could disappear so completely, what protection does anyone have? Our next case takes us back in time, to a summer day in Yellowstone nearly 60 years ago. A family outing that turned into tragedy. A 16-year-old boy who went looking for his lost sister and never returned. And a search operation so massive that it should have found something, anything, but found nothing at all. The year is 1966, and Joshua Johnson is about to walk into the wilderness and out of history. Yellowstone in the 1960s was a different place than it is today. Fewer visitors, fewer regulations. Families would drive into the park and let their children explore with a freedom that seems unimaginable now. The wilderness was seen as a playground, a place of wonder and adventure. The dangers were acknowledged but often underestimated. Parents trusted that the park was safe because it was a park, a place managed by the government, a place with rangers and roads and signs pointing to attractions. The Johnson family arrived in Yellowstone during the summer of 1966 for what was supposed to be a memorable vacation. The father had brought his two children, a 16-year-old son named Joshua and a younger daughter. They had driven from their home to experience the geysers, the wildlife, and the vast open spaces that defined the American West. Like thousands of other families that summer, They expected to create happy memories. What happened instead would haunt the family for the rest of their lives. The details of how the incident began are painfully ordinary. At some point during their visit, the younger daughter wandered away from her father and brother. This was not unusual. Children get distracted. They see something interesting and follow it. In the pre-cell phone era, in a landscape where forests and thermal features stretched in every direction, a momentary lapse in attention could put significant distance between a child and their guardians. When the father realized his daughter was missing, he made a decision that any parent might make. He and Joshua would split up to search for her. One would go in one direction, one in another. They would cover more ground that way. They would find her faster. The father went one way. Joshua went another. The daughter was found relatively quickly. She had not gone far. She was scared, but unharmed. The crisis appeared to be over. The father gathered her up and waited for Joshua to return. Joshua did not return. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. The father called out. He retraced his steps to where he had last seen his son. Nothing. He searched the immediate area with growing panic. Nothing. He flagged down other visitors and asked if they had seen a teenage boy. No one had. By the time park rangers were notified, a significant amount of time had elapsed. The exact timeline is difficult to reconstruct from historical records, but what is clear is that Joshua Johnson, 16 years old, had walked into the Yellowstone wilderness and vanished. The search that followed was one of the largest in the history of Yellowstone National Park up to that point. Rangers, volunteers, and military personnel were mobilized. The area where Joshua had last been seen was identified and became the center of an expanding grid search. Teams fanned out through the forest, calling his name, looking for any sign of his passage. The numbers are staggering for an operation in that era. Approximately 100 square miles were searched over the following days and weeks. Hundreds of people participated. Aircraft flew over the terrain, scanning for any flash of color or movement that might indicate a person in distress. Tracking dogs were brought in to follow scent trails. Every resource available was deployed. They found nothing. Not a footprint. Not a piece of clothing. Not a broken branch that might indicate someone had passed through. Joshua Johnson had walked into the forest and left no trace whatsoever. It was as if he had stepped through an invisible door and closed it behind him. The terrain where Joshua disappeared was not exceptionally remote by Yellowstone standards. It was wilderness, certainly, but it was not the deep backcountry of the thoroughfare or the high peaks of the Absaroka Range. This was an area that visitors frequented, an area with trails and landmarks, an area where a 16-year-old should have been able to find his way back, or at least be found by searchers. But the forest didn't give him up. As days turned into weeks and the search continued to produce nothing, the family grew desperate. The father, consumed by guilt over the decision to split up, refused to accept that his son was simply gone. He hired private investigators. He consulted with anyone who might offer insight into what had happened, and eventually, in an act of desperation that reflects the depth of his anguish, he consulted a psychic. The psychic claimed to have visions of what had happened to Joshua. In one vision, the boy had drowned in a water-filled ditch or drainage. In another, he had fallen into a canyon and lay injured or dead at the bottom. These visions were specific enough that search teams actually investigated the locations described. They checked every water feature in the area. They rappelled into canyons and examined the bases of cliffs. They found nothing. The psychic visions led nowhere. The massive search produced no results. Joshua Johnson remained missing. Over the decades since, the case has faded from public memory. Unlike some disappearances that generate ongoing media attention, the Johnson case has become a historical footnote, mentioned occasionally in discussions of Yellowstone mysteries, but rarely examined in detail. The family eventually had to return home, had to resume their lives, had to find a way to exist with the unbearable weight of not knowing. What happened to Joshua Johnson? The official assumption, stated or unstated, is that he died somewhere in the wilderness, and his remains were simply never found. This is the default explanation for missing persons cases where no body is recovered. The wilderness is vast. Animals scatter remains. Vegetation grows over bones. A person can vanish into the ecosystem and leave nothing behind. But this explanation becomes harder to accept when you consider the scale of the search. 100 square miles, hundreds of searchers, dogs trained to detect human scent, aircraft providing aerial surveillance. This was not a cursory effort. This was a systematic, exhaustive attempt to find one teenage boy in a defined area, and it produced absolutely nothing. Consider what that means. Joshua was not a small child who might have crawled into a hidden space and been overlooked. He was 16 years old, presumably wearing normal clothing that would contrast with the natural environment. He had been missing for only a short time before the search began, meaning he could not have traveled an enormous distance. The area was searched thoroughly by experienced personnel, and yet nothing. No body, no bones, no clothing, no trace. The lack of any physical evidence is what makes this case so troubling. In most wilderness fatalities, something is eventually found. A shoe, a piece of fabric, scattered bones. The wilderness is efficient at breaking down organic matter, but it rarely eliminates every trace. The complete absence of evidence in the Johnson case suggests one of two possibilities. Either Joshua traveled far beyond the search area before meeting his fate, which seems unlikely given the timeline, or something happened to him that the searchers were not equipped to understand or investigate. Theories about what might have happened range from the mundane to the disturbing. The disorientation theory suggests that Joshua became lost, panicked, and ran in a direction that took him far from the search area. People who are lost sometimes make irrational decisions. They move when they should stay still. They travel in circles without realizing it. They push deeper into wilderness instead of toward safety. Under this theory, Joshua covered significant ground before succumbing to exposure, injury, or exhaustion, and his remains are simply in a location that was never searched. The predator theory proposes that Joshua encountered a dangerous animal shortly after separating from his father. Grizzly bears were present in Yellowstone in the 1960s, as were mountain lions. An attack by a large predator could explain the absence of remains, as animals will sometimes drag prey to a secluded location and consume it almost entirely. However, predator attacks typically leave some evidence at the scene: blood, torn earth, disturbed vegetation, and no such signs were reported in the Johnson case. The human intervention theory raises the darkest possibility. Could Joshua have encountered another person in the forest, someone with harmful intentions? Abductions from national parks are rare, but not unheard of. The 1960s were a time of less surveillance, fewer visitors logging their movements, and more opportunities for a crime to go unwitnessed. If someone took Joshua, the complete absence of physical evidence would make more sense. The search was looking for a lost boy, not for signs of a struggle or a vehicle leaving the area. This theory is troubling because it has no supporting evidence. No suspicious individuals were reported in the area. No vehicles were seen where they should not have been. No witnesses ever came forward with information suggesting foul play. But the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. If a predatory individual operated in Yellowstone in 1966 and was careful, they might never have been detected. The final category of theories considers possibilities that official investigators do not typically acknowledge. Joshua Johnson disappeared in a national park under circumstances that match a pattern documented across hundreds of similar cases. A person separates from a group or family member. They walk a short distance into the wilderness. A massive search finds nothing. No remains are ever recovered. This pattern has been observed in parks across the country, in different decades, in different terrain. The consistency is unsettling. It suggests that something is happening in American wilderness that we do not understand. Whether that something is a natural phenomenon we have not identified, a predator human or otherwise that we have not caught, or something else entirely, no one can say. What we can say is that Joshua Johnson fits the pattern. He walked into the forest. The forest did not give him back. Nearly 60 years later, the case remains officially unsolved. No remains have ever been found. No closure has ever been provided to the family. The father who made the decision to split up, who sent his son in one direction while he went in another, lived with that choice for the rest of his life. If you are finding these patterns as disturbing as we do, share this video with someone who needs to hear these stories. The more people who know about these cases, the greater the chance that someone will finally provide answers. Drop your theories in the comments. We read every single one. Our next case shares something crucial with the Johnson disappearance. Like Joshua, the person who vanished was not a casual tourist unfamiliar with the wilderness. She was someone who worked in the park, someone who knew the trails, someone who should have been able to navigate a simple day hike without difficulty. But the wilderness does not care about our qualifications. It takes who it wants. And in August of 2000, it took Jane Ruppert. Yosemite National Park occupies nearly 1,200 square miles of the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California. It is a landscape of superlatives. The tallest waterfall in North America, some of the largest granite monoliths on Earth, giant sequoia trees that have stood for thousands of years. Millions of visitors come each year to witness natural features that have become icons of American wilderness. But Yosemite is also a place where people disappear. The park terrain is extreme. Cliffs drop thousands of feet. Rivers rage with snowmelt. Trails traverse exposed rock where a single misstep can be fatal. Even experienced hikers sometimes underestimate the challenges. Jane Ruppert was not one of those people. In the summer of 2000, Jane was working as a seasonal employee in Yosemite. The specifics of her position vary in different accounts, but what is clear is that she was someone who had chosen to spend her summer in the park, living and working in one of the most beautiful places on the continent. She was in her 30s, experienced in the outdoors, and comfortable with solo hiking. Jane had originally planned a multi-day backpacking trip into the Yosemite backcountry. This kind of trip was well within her capabilities. She had the gear, the experience, and the familiarity with the terrain to handle it safely. But shortly before the trip, she developed an infection that required medical attention. The multi-day trek would have to wait until she recovered. Instead of the ambitious backpacking route, Jane decided to do a simpler day hike. She would walk from the Yosemite Falls area toward a region called Foresta, a small community on the western edge of the park. The route was manageable for a single day. She knew the trails. She had done similar hikes before. On August 14, 2000, Jane was seen in the area of Curry Village and the Yosemite Medical Clinic, presumably related to treatment for her infection. Later that day, she set out on her hike. She was traveling light, with a day pack rather than the full gear she would have carried on her original backpacking trip. She never returned. When Jane failed to appear at the end of the day, concern grew among those who knew her. She was not the type to simply abandon her plans without notice. She was responsible, reliable, and aware of the importance of checking in after wilderness travel. Something was wrong. A search was initiated. Rangers began covering the trails between Yosemite Falls and Foresta, looking for any sign of Jane. They checked trailheads for her vehicle. They interviewed other hikers who had been in the area that day. They followed standard protocols for a missing hiker. They found nothing. No witnesses reported seeing Jane on the trail that day. No one remembered passing a solo female hiker matching her description. It was as if she had walked to the trailhead and then simply ceased to exist. The trails she should have taken showed no sign of her passage. The search expanded. More personnel were brought in. The area between Yosemite Falls and Foresta was scoured by teams on foot, by helicopter, by searchers with tracking dogs. The terrain was challenging, with steep slopes, dense vegetation, and drainages that could conceal a person from view. But the search was thorough, and it produced no results. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Jane Ruppert remained missing, and her case joined the long list of unsolved disappearances in Yosemite, filed away, but not forgotten by those who had known her. Then, 8 years later, something emerged from the wilderness. In 2008, searchers or hikers in an area called Fireplace Creek Drainage discovered a backpack. The drainage is a rugged, difficult-to-access area that lies along a rough line between Yosemite Falls and Foresta, the route Jane had intended to travel. The backpack was identified as belonging to Jane Ruppert. The discovery should have provided answers. Instead, it created more questions. The backpack was found alone. There were no human remains anywhere nearby. No bones. No clothing other than what was in the pack. No indication of what had happened to the person who had carried it. Just a bag sitting in the wilderness, waiting to be found for 8 years. The location of the discovery was significant. Fireplace Creek Drainage is not on any maintained trail. It is not a place where a hiker following a normal route would end up. The terrain is steep and heavily vegetated, the kind of place you would only go if you were deliberately leaving the trail or if something had gone terribly wrong. How did her backpack end up there? One possibility is that Jane herself went there, deliberately or accidentally leaving the trail and descending into the drainage. Perhaps she was trying to take a shortcut. Perhaps she became disoriented. Perhaps she was fleeing from something. Once in the drainage, she could have suffered a fatal fall, a medical emergency related to her infection, or some other catastrophe. Her body could have been consumed by animals over the following years, with the backpack surviving because it was made of synthetic materials. But this explanation has problems. If Jane died in or near where the backpack was found, there should have been some remains. Bones persist in the environment for years. Even if animals scattered them, something should have been present. A femur, a skull fragment, a shoe. The complete absence of any human remains near the backpack is difficult to explain. Another possibility is that the backpack was moved after her death. Animals can drag objects considerable distances. A bear might have grabbed the pack looking for food and carried it away from where Jane actually fell. Under this theory, her remains could be somewhere else entirely, in a location that was never searched or that is even more inaccessible than Fireplace Creek Drainage. But this raises its own questions. If animals moved the pack, why was it found in relatively intact condition? Bears that tear into backpacks looking for food typically destroy them in the process. The pack found in 2008 was identifiable, which suggests it was not extensively mauled by wildlife. A third possibility is that another person moved the backpack. This is the darkest interpretation, and there is no direct evidence to support it. But if someone harmed Jane Ruppert on that August day in 2000, they might have disposed of her body in one location and her belongings in another, making it harder to piece together what happened. The pack eventually surfaced because it was left in a place where searchers or hikers would eventually pass. The body was disposed of more thoroughly. This theory asks us to consider that Jane Ruppert may not have been the victim of an accident. She may have been the victim of a crime. Yosemite has a history that makes this possibility impossible to ignore. In 1999, just 1 year before Jane disappeared, a series of murders occurred in and around the park. A handyman named Cary Stayner killed 4 women in separate incidents, targeting solo females in isolated locations. Stayner was eventually caught and confessed, and he is currently on death row in California. There is no evidence linking Stayner to her disappearance. He was arrested in 1999 and was in custody when Jane vanished in 2000. But his crimes demonstrated that predators can and do operate in national parks, targeting vulnerable individuals in places where help is far away. If one such predator was active in Yosemite, there could have been others. The official investigation into Jane Ruppert's disappearance has never been closed, but it has also never produced answers. She is officially listed as a missing person. Her remains have never been found. The backpack in Fireplace Creek Drainage is the only physical evidence that ever emerged, and it raises more questions than it answers. What happened to Jane Ruppert on August 14, 2000? Did she wander off trail and die in the wilderness, her body consumed by the ecosystem over the following years? Did she fall victim to a medical emergency related to the infection that had already disrupted her travel plans? Did she encounter someone in the park who meant her harm? Or did something else happen? Something that connects her disappearance to the dozens of other cases where experienced wilderness travelers have simply vanished? We do not know. The Sierra Nevada is not giving up its secrets. 8 years of silence, and then a backpack. That is all the mountains offered. That is all we have. Jane Ruppert was not a novice. She was a park employee. She knew Yosemite. She knew the trails. She was doing a hike well within her abilities on a day when the weather was fine and the terrain was familiar. And still she vanished. The pattern continues. Experienced people. Familiar terrain. Massive searches. No answers. Our final case brings us to the present day, and to a man whose entire life was built around moving through mountain terrain. A trail runner who had logged thousands of miles in the Rockies. A man who knew Long's Peak as well as anyone alive. A man who should have been able to navigate its slopes in his sleep. Chad Pallench was 49 years old when he walked onto the mountain on September 27, 2023. He never walked off. Rocky Mountain National Park rises from the Colorado Plains like a wall of stone and ice. Over 400 square miles of alpine terrain with more than 60 peaks exceeding 12,000 feet. The park contains some of the most dramatic vertical relief in North America, with valleys sitting at 8,000 feet and summits pushing past 14,000. Long's Peak, at 14,259 feet, dominates the skyline and draws climbers and hikers from around the world. But Long's Peak is not just a destination for tourists seeking a summit photo. It is a testing ground for serious mountain athletes. The peak and its surrounding ridges offer technical routes that challenge even experienced alpinists. Ice couloirs, knife-edge traverses, exposed scrambles over loose rock. This is terrain that demands respect and punishes mistakes. Every year, people are injured on Long's Peak. Some years, people die. Chad Pallench knew all of this. He had spent decades learning these mountains. At 49 years old, he was not a weekend warrior looking for adventure. He was an elite trail runner, an engineer by profession, but a mountain athlete by passion. He had completed ultramarathons covering distances that most people cannot imagine running. He had logged thousands of miles on the trails of Colorado, including countless hours on and around Long's Peak. His friends and fellow runners described him as meticulous. He studied routes obsessively before attempting them. He understood weather patterns, snow conditions, and the technical demands of every approach. He carried appropriate gear. He told people where he was going. He was the kind of person who did everything right because he understood that the mountains do not forgive carelessness. On September 27, 2023, Chad drove to the Long's Peak trailhead and parked his vehicle. He was planning a long solo run that would take him through some of the most technical terrain in the park. The exact route he intended to follow has been reconstructed from his previous runs and his general preferences, but the specifics are not entirely certain. What is known is that he favored challenging off-trail routes that most hikers would never consider. Couloirs filled with loose scree, snowfields that persisted into autumn, ridge traverses that required careful footwork and full concentration. This was not reckless behavior. For Chad, these routes were calculated challenges, the kind of terrain he had trained for years to handle. He was not pushing beyond his abilities. He was operating at the edge of what he knew he could do, which is exactly where elite athletes live. He was expected to return to his vehicle by evening. When he did not appear, his emergency contacts were notified. By the following morning, search and rescue operations were underway. The initial search focused on the routes Chad was known to prefer. Teams familiar with his running history could make educated guesses about where he might have gone. They checked the keyhole route, the standard path to the summit of Long's Peak. They checked the loft route, a more technical alternative. They checked the couloirs and ridges that Chad had run in the past. Helicopters scanned the terrain from above. Ground teams worked their way through boulder fields and across snow patches. The search was complicated by the vastness of the area and the technical nature of the terrain. Some of the places Chad might have gone were not accessible to casual searchers. Specialized mountain rescue personnel were required to check certain routes safely. The weather in late September can be unpredictable in the Colorado high country. Temperatures swing wildly between day and night. Snow can fall at any time. The search teams were working against the clock, knowing that each passing hour reduced the chances of finding Chad alive if he was injured somewhere on the mountain. Days passed. The search expanded, then contracted, then expanded again as new theories emerged about where Chad might have gone. More than 50 people participated in the effort at its peak. Drones supplemented helicopter coverage. Tracking dogs were deployed in areas where scent trails might be detectable. The handlers reported that the dogs picked up a scent at the trailhead, but lost it within the first mile. They circled, they searched, but they could not reacquire the trail. It was as if Chad had walked a short distance into the wilderness and then simply stopped existing. No footprints in the patches of snow that lingered at high elevation. No equipment dropped or abandoned. No signs of a fall or a struggle. Chad Palance had walked into Rocky Mountain National Park and left no trace of his passage beyond the vehicle sitting in the parking lot. The lack of results was not for lack of effort. The searchers knew Chad, or knew of him. He was a respected figure in the Colorado trail running community. People wanted to find him. People pushed hard, took risks, searched places that were genuinely dangerous because they hoped he might be there, injured but alive, waiting for rescue. But the mountain was silent. What made the search even more painful was the parallel operation happening at the same time. Another person had gone missing in Rocky Mountain National Park in the same general time frame. Lucas Makaj, a hiker, had also failed to return from a trip into the backcountry. Search teams were looking for both men simultaneously, covering overlapping terrain, hoping to find either or both. Lucas Makaj was found. His body was located in an area consistent with his planned route. His death appeared to be the result of a fall or an accident. It was tragic, but it was comprehensible. The mountain had taken him in a way that mountains sometimes take people. His family received the terrible news, but they also received closure. They knew what had happened. They could bring him home. Chad Palance was not found. The contrast is stark and deeply troubling. Two men, the same park, the same general time frame. One is found, one is not. One leaves enough evidence for searchers to locate him. The other leaves nothing. Why? What was different about his disappearance? The search for Chad was eventually scaled back, then suspended. The official determination was that he had likely suffered a fatal accident somewhere in the backcountry, and that his remains were in a location that searchers had been unable to reach. This is the standard language for cases where no body is recovered. It offers a plausible explanation without providing any actual answers. But those who knew Chad have struggled to accept this conclusion. Chad was not someone who made mistakes in the mountains. His entire approach to trail running was built on careful preparation and calculated risk management. He knew Long's Peak. He had run its slopes dozens of times. He understood where the dangers were and how to mitigate them. More importantly, the terrain around Long's Peak is not so vast or so inaccessible that a body should simply vanish. Search teams covered an enormous area. Helicopters flew over every visible slope. Drones peered into crevices and couloirs. If Chad had fallen somewhere on the mountain, there should have been some sign. A splash of color from his clothing. A piece of equipment tumbled down a slope. Something. Instead, there was nothing. A 49-year-old man with decades of mountain experience walked onto Long's Peak and disappeared as completely as if he had never existed. Several theories have been proposed to explain what happened. The fall theory suggests that Chad slipped or lost his footing on technical terrain and fell into a location that is essentially invisible from the search angles used. The mountains around Long's Peak include deep crevices between boulders, snow-filled gullies that can swallow a person, and cliff bands that drop into shadowed zones rarely seen by anyone. If Chad fell into such a location, his body might remain hidden indefinitely. Future climbers or hikers might eventually stumble upon remains years or decades from now, as has happened in other mountain disappearances. This theory is plausible but unsatisfying. Chad was an expert at exactly this kind of terrain. He had navigated it successfully hundreds of times. For him to make a fatal error on a route he knew well, on a day when conditions were not reported as unusually dangerous, seems inconsistent with his experience and skill level. The medical theory proposes that Chad suffered a sudden health emergency while on the mountain: a heart attack, a stroke, an aneurysm. These events can strike without warning, even in athletes who appear to be in peak physical condition. If Chad collapsed suddenly in a remote location, he would have been unable to call for help or signal his position. His body would have been wherever he fell, invisible to searchers who did not happen to pass within visual range. This theory cannot be ruled out, but it also cannot be confirmed without finding remains. And it still does not explain why the extensive search produced no evidence at all. A person who collapses does not disappear. Their body remains where it falls. The search covered the routes Chad was likely to have taken. If he collapsed on or near those routes, he should have been found. The disorientation theory suggests that something caused Chad to deviate dramatically from his planned route. Perhaps he encountered unexpected conditions. Perhaps he was trying to avoid a hazard. Perhaps he simply made an uncharacteristic navigation error. Under this theory, Chad ended up somewhere that searchers never thought to look because it was so far from his expected path. This theory is difficult to accept for those who knew Chad. He was not the kind of runner who got lost. His knowledge of these mountains was encyclopedic. For him to wander so far off course that searchers could not find him seems inconsistent with everything known about his abilities. The final theory ventures into territory that raises deeply uncomfortable questions. Chad Palance was an elite athlete. He was mentally sharp, professionally successful, and by all accounts living a full and meaningful life. But people sometimes carry burdens that others cannot see. The mountains offer a kind of privacy that is hard to find elsewhere. Is it possible that Chad went into the wilderness that day with intentions he did not share with anyone? Those who knew him have rejected this theory emphatically. They describe him as happy, engaged, and looking forward to future adventures. There is no evidence to support the idea that he was struggling with anything that might lead to such a decision. But in the absence of a body, in the absence of any evidence at all, the question cannot be completely dismissed. What is left when all the theories fall short? Chad Palance was one of the most experienced mountain runners in Colorado. He knew Long's Peak better than most people know their own neighborhoods. He was not reckless. He was not unprepared. He was not someone who made mistakes. And yet the mountain took him. The search found Lucas McCodge. It did not find Chad. Same park, same time frame, different outcomes. As if something selected one and not the other. As if whatever took Chad did not want him to be found. This is the pattern that researchers have noted across hundreds of wilderness disappearances. Experienced people vanish in places they know well. Massive searches find nothing. The wilderness keeps its secrets. We do not know what happened to Chad Palance. His case remains officially open. His friends and family continue to hope that someday, somehow, answers will emerge. But as of now, Long's Peak holds on to one more mystery. And the trail running community has lost one of its own to a fate that no one can explain. If you have made it this far, you understand that these 4 cases are not isolated incidents. They are part of something larger, something that has been happening in American wilderness for as long as records have been kept. Something that no one has been able to stop or even explain. Let us consider what connects these cases. We have examined 4 disappearances spanning nearly 60 years. Austin King in 2024, Joshua Johnson in 1966, Jane Ruppert in 2000, Chad Palance in 2023. Different parks, different decades, different circumstances, but the same outcome. People walking into the wilderness and never coming out. Massive searches finding nothing. Questions that remain unanswered. The first pattern is experience. These were not lost tourists who wandered off marked trails because they did not know any better. Austin King was a park employee who had spent a summer learning Yellowstone. Joshua Johnson was a teenager who had been in the park with his family and was searching a defined area for his sister. Jane Ruppert was a seasonal worker in Yosemite who knew the trails around her workplace. Chad Palance was an elite athlete with decades of mountain experience who had run Long's Peak more times than most people have visited any wilderness area. Experience did not protect them. Knowledge did not save them. The wilderness took them anyway. The second pattern is the absence of evidence. In all 4 cases, searchers found almost nothing. Austin King left a campsite and a note. Joshua Johnson left nothing at all. Jane Ruppert left only a backpack that appeared 8 years later in an impossible location. Chad Palance left only his vehicle in a parking lot. No bodies, no remains, no clothing scattered in the forest, no equipment dropped along a trail. These people did not just die in the wilderness. They vanished from it. The distinction matters. People who die in wilderness areas leave evidence. Their bodies decompose but leave bones. Their clothing persists. Their gear survives. Something remains. In these cases, almost nothing remained. It is as if the wilderness consumed them completely. The third pattern is the failure of searches. Each of these disappearances prompted a significant search effort. Austin King had over 90 searchers, plus helicopters and drones. Joshua Johnson prompted one of the largest searches in Yellowstone history, covering 100 square miles. Jane Ruppert was searched for extensively in the weeks following her disappearance. Chad Palance had more than 50 searchers working terrain they knew well. None of these searches succeeded. Despite massive resources, despite experienced personnel, despite coverage that should have been sufficient to find anyone in the search areas, these people were not found. How is that possible? The areas were not so vast that a person could simply be overlooked. The searches were not cursory. These were serious, sustained efforts by people who knew what they were doing. And yet, they failed. The fourth pattern is terrain with significance. Yellowstone is the oldest national park in the world, a place of geological power that indigenous peoples considered sacred and dangerous. Yosemite contains features that have inspired spiritual awe for centuries. Rocky Mountain National Park includes peaks that the Arapaho and other tribes approached with reverence and caution. These are not ordinary forests or fields. These are places where the boundary between the human world and something else feels thin. Places where people have reported strange experiences for generations. Places where the rules we live by in our daily lives seem not to apply. Is there a connection between the spiritual significance of these places and the disappearances that occur there? We cannot say, but the correlation is difficult to ignore. The fifth pattern is the selection of victims. Why these people? Why not others? Thousands of visitors enter these parks every day. Most of them return safely. What was different about Austin, Joshua, Jane, and Chad? One answer might be that they were alone. All 4 were traveling solo or had separated from companions when they vanished. Solitude creates vulnerability. There is no one to witness what happens, no one to call for help, no one to report that something is wrong until hours or days have passed. But solitude alone does not explain why these particular individuals vanished while thousands of other solo travelers have returned safely. Something selected them. Something chose them. What that something was, we do not know. What are we to conclude from these cases? The official explanations follow a predictable formula: lost, fell, injured, died, remains not recovered. These explanations are designed to close cases, to provide families with something resembling closure, to reassure the public that what happened was tragic, but comprehensible. But these official conclusions explain nothing. They describe what might have happened while ignoring the evidence that does not fit. They close cases that should remain open. They provide answers that are not really answers. The evidence tells us that something is happening in American wilderness that we do not understand. Experienced people are vanishing. Massive searches are finding nothing. Bodies are not being recovered even in terrain that has been thoroughly searched. What force could cause a person to disappear so completely? What phenomenon could defeat the efforts of hundreds of searchers, helicopters, drones, and tracking dogs? What is happening in these wild places that defies our expectations and our explanations? Some researchers have proposed that there is a natural phenomenon we have not yet discovered, something about certain locations that affects human perception or navigation, something that causes people to become lost in ways that conventional search methods cannot address. This theory is speculative, but it attempts to explain the consistency of the pattern. Others have proposed that predators, human or otherwise, are operating in wilderness areas with a level of sophistication that allows them to avoid detection. Serial predators have been known to operate in remote locations precisely because victims are vulnerable, and evidence is difficult to preserve. If such predators are active in national parks, they might account for some of the disappearances that are never explained. Still others have proposed explanations that venture beyond the boundaries of conventional science. Dimensional anomalies, entities that exist outside our normal perception. Forces that have been documented in folklore and legend for centuries, but that modern society refuses to acknowledge. We are not in a position to say which of these theories, if any, is correct. What we can say is that the conventional explanations are inadequate. Something is happening, and no one knows what it is. What should we do with this information? We should be aware. If you are planning to visit a national park, understand that the wilderness is not entirely safe. People disappear in these places. Experienced people, prepared people, people who do everything right. The wilderness does not care about your preparation. It does not respect your experience. It takes who it wants to take. We should be cautious. If you hike alone, tell someone where you are going and when you expect to return. Carry communication devices. Stay on marked trails when possible. Understand that venturing into remote areas involves risks that cannot be fully mitigated. We should ask questions. Why are these cases not more widely publicized? Why do official agencies seem reluctant to acknowledge the patterns? What information is being withheld, and why? The public has a right to know what is happening on public lands. We should remember the missing. Austin King, who reached the summit of Eagle Peak and sent a message home before vanishing into the clouds. Joshua Johnson, who went looking for his lost sister and became lost himself, never to return. Jane Ruppert, who knew Yosemite and was doing a simple day hike when the mountains swallowed her, leaving only a backpack years later. Chad Pallench, who had run Long's Peak more times than most people climb any mountain, and who walked onto its slopes one September morning and never walked off. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve answers that have not been found. There is one more thing we want to leave you with. In researching these cases, we noticed something that we cannot explain. Each of these people was doing something they had done before. Austin King had hiked in Yellowstone all summer. Joshua Johnson was searching a familiar area near his family. Jane Ruppert was walking a route she knew from her work in the park. Chad Pallench was running terrain he had covered dozens of times. They were not in unfamiliar territory. They were not taking unusual risks. They were doing what they had always done, in places they knew, using skills they had developed over time. And yet, on one particular day, for one particular journey, something was different. The wilderness that had always allowed them to pass did not let them through. The mountain that had always released them kept them. Why that day? Why that trip? What changed between all the times they returned safely and the one time they did not? We do not know, but we will keep asking. If you have information about any of the cases discussed in this video, please contact the relevant authorities. The National Park Service maintains records on missing persons. The families have never stopped hoping that someone, somewhere, knows something that could bring closure. If you found this examination valuable, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others who might want to know about these disappearances. Leave your theories in the comments. What do you think is really happening in American wilderness? What explains these disappearances that official sources cannot or will not explain? We read every comment, and we will continue to investigate. Until next time, be careful in the wild places. Tell someone where you are going. And remember that the mountains, beautiful as they are, do not always let people leave. Thank you for watching. Stay safe out there.